High above the clouds, where the air grows thin and the jagged peaks of the Andes Mountains pierce the sky, lie the silent remains of a civilization that defied all odds. Imagine a world where the terrain is so unforgiving, so vertically extreme, that mere survival seems like a monumental achievement. Yet, it was in this very landscape of plunging ravines and towering summits that one of the greatest empires in human history was born. This is a story of a people who did not just conquer the mountains, but wove their entire existence into the fabric of the stone and the stars. They built a sprawling, magnificent empire without the use of the wheel, without iron or steel tools to carve their monuments, and without a written language to record their triumphs. It feels almost impossible to modern minds, yet the enduring fortresses and vast agricultural terraces clinging to the sides of cliffs stand as undeniable proof of their unparalleled genius. They were the Inca, the children of the sun. In little more than a century, they transformed a small, unassuming highland kingdom into the largest empire the pre-Columbian Americas had ever seen. At its zenith, their realm stretched for thousands of miles along the western spine of South America, sweeping from the lush borders of modern-day Colombia down through arid coastal deserts and deep into the freezing reaches of Chile. They ruled over millions of subjects spanning drastically diverse landscapes and countless unique tribes, binding them all together through a masterpiece of administration, breathtaking engineering, and sheer spiritual devotion. But who were the men and women who breathed life into this vast network of woven grass bridges and stone cities? How did an ordinary family survive, thrive, and find joy in the shadow of emperors who were worshipped as living gods walking the earth? To truly understand the Inca, we must look beyond the famous, mist-shrouded ruins of Machu Picchu and the legendary tales of lost gold. We have to walk the ancient paths they carved into the mountainsides, feel the rhythmic pulse of their daily labor, and listen to the echoes of a culture that refused to be silenced by the passage of time or the clash of conquest. This is not merely a history of impressive stonework and powerful conquerors, but a deeply human journey into the heart of a society that balanced its existence on the very edge of the world. Let us step back in time, into the realm of the sun, and uncover the brilliant, complex, and deeply spiritual world of the Inca. To comprehend the true spirit of the Inca, one must first surrender to the sheer, terrifying majesty of their homeland. The Andes are not merely a mountain range. They are a formidable, jagged spine of stone that dominates the western edge of South America, rising fiercely from the earth to create an environment of extremes that would easily break a lesser civilization. Imagine standing at an elevation of more than 10 or 12,000 feet, where the air is so extraordinarily thin that every breath requires conscious, labored effort. The biting wind carries the perpetual chill of snow-capped summits, while the unfiltered, high-altitude sun beats down with a searing intensity, creating a world of harsh contrasts between brilliant light and freezing shadow. To the west of these towering peaks lies the Pacific coast, bordered by deserts so profoundly dry that decades can pass without a single drop of rain ever touching the sand. To the east, the landscape plunges wildly and steeply into the dense, sweltering green abyss of the Amazon rainforest. Caught in the middle of these geographical extremes sits the Andean Plateau, a rugged, unpredictable world of deep, shadowy ravines, rushing rivers, and vast, high-altitude grasslands known as the Puna. It is a place of stark, breathtaking beauty, but it is also exceptionally unforgiving, demanding absolute resilience from anyone who dares to call it home. This spectacular and volatile landscape did more than just provide a dramatic backdrop for the Inca. It actively forged their psychology and shaped their deeply ingrained worldview. When you live in a world where sudden earthquakes can shatter the ground beneath your feet, where unexpected frosts can annihilate an entire season's harvest overnight, and where torrential downpours can wash away whole communities, you quickly learn that humanity is not the master of nature. Instead, the Andean people developed a profound, reverent humility toward the world around them. They did not view the mountains as dead rock or mere physical obstacles to be conquered. To them, the towering peaks were living, breathing deities known as Apus, powerful ancient spirits that commanded the weather, protected the people, and demanded constant respect and appeasement. This harsh environment cultivated an extraordinary communal toughness and an unwavering belief that survival was simply impossible in isolation. Independence was a luxury no one could afford in the high Andes, and so a culture deeply rooted in mutual labor, shared resources, and profound familial bonds began to take shape, binding neighbors together out of absolute necessity. Driven by the urgent need to feed their people in a relentlessly vertical world, the inhabitants of the Andes became brilliant masters of adaptation. Rather than fighting the steep, rocky slopes, they learned to sculpt them, transforming perilous cliffs into cascading agricultural terraces that looked like giant green staircases climbing endlessly toward the heavens. These terraces did much more than create flat land for farming. They acted as magnificent, large-scale solar heaters. The carefully laid stone walls absorbed the intense rays of the high-altitude sun during the day and slowly released that trapped warmth throughout the freezing nights, creating protected microclimates that allowed delicate crops to thrive at seemingly impossible elevations. Down in the deep winding valleys carved by sacred rivers like the Urubamba, the soil was richer and the air was significantly warmer, offering a completely different ecological reality just a few thousand feet below the freezing highlands. The true genius of the Andean people lay in their ability to orchestrate a vast, intricate network of exchange across these incredibly diverse zones. By moving goods vertically up and down the mountain paths, they ensured that coastal sea salt, valley-grown maize, and high-altitude root vegetables all circulated within their communities, creating a resilient web of survival. Ultimately, the environment of the Andes was a crucible, a rigorous testing ground that demanded innovation, relentless discipline, and absolute unity. It shaped a people who were physically tough, remarkably resourceful, and intimately connected to the subtle rhythms of the earth and the shifting patterns of the night sky. They learned to read the stars to precisely time their planting seasons, to listen to the shifting winds for signs of rain, and to build their homes in careful harmony with the fault lines of the earth. Out of this beautiful, brutal landscape, scattered tribes and isolated valley communities slowly learned to adapt over centuries, laying the complex groundwork for something far greater than themselves. The stage was set, majestic and perilous, waiting for a sudden spark of ambition to ignite the scattered mountain peoples into a single unstoppable force. That spark would soon emerge from the shimmering, mythical waters of a high-altitude lake, giving birth to a lineage of rulers who would dare to claim the sun itself as their divine father. Every great empire begins with a story, a foundational myth that gives its people a divine sense of purpose and a profound connection to the universe. For the Inca, that story begins upon the mirrored high-altitude waters of Lake Titicaca, a place so vast, cold, and silent that it feels like the very roof of the world. Legend tells us that Inti, the great sun god, looked down upon the earth and felt a deep, overwhelming sorrow for the wild, chaotic state of humanity. Seeking to bring order, knowledge, and civilization to the scattered warring tribes of the Andes, he sent his own children, Manco Qhapaq and Mama Ayllu, emerging from the shimmering, mystical depths of the lake. They were given a single, golden staff and instructed to walk northward through the rugged mountains until they found a place where the staff would sink effortlessly into the earth, signaling a soil fertile enough to birth a new world. After a long, arduous journey through the unforgiving highlands, they arrived at a lush, sheltered valley surrounded by protective, watchful peaks. Here, the golden staff sank deep into the rich, welcoming dirt. This sacred valley was Cusco, destined to become the navel of the world. And it was here that the children of the sun laid the very first stones of what would eventually become a sprawling, unmatched empire. Yet, history is rarely as seamless as the myths suggest. For centuries, the Inca were not mighty emperors at all, but merely a small, relatively obscure tribe battling for daily survival in the crowded, fiercely competitive highlands. They lived among dozens of other independent warlords and chieftains, occasionally forming alliances through marriage and frequently engaging in bitter, bloody skirmishes over fertile land and precious fresh water. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, the rulers of Cusco slowly consolidated their power over the immediate valley, but they remained a modest kingdom, constantly looking over their shoulders at powerful neighboring states. Their rise to continental dominance was not a slow, inevitable march of progress over thousands of years, but a sudden, violent explosion triggered by a desperate fight for their very existence. The catalyst for this unimaginable transformation came in the early 15th century, in the form of a terrifying, bloodthirsty rival tribe known as the Chanca, who marched upon Cusco with the singular goal of wiping the Inca off the face of the earth. As the massive Chanca army descended upon the valley, the reigning Inca ruler, Viracocha, looked upon the overwhelming enemy forces and did the unthinkable. He abandoned his capital, fleeing into the mountains with his chosen heir and leaving Cusco to its fiery doom. But one of his younger sons, a fierce and visionary prince named Cusi Yupanqui, refused to run. Rallying the terrified defenders who remained behind, he prepared to make a final, seemingly suicidal stand for his home. In the desperate heat of battle, as the fate of the entire Inca lineage hung by a precarious thread, legend says that the very stones of the battlefield rose up, transforming into enchanted warriors to fight alongside the outnumbered defenders. Against all rational odds, the young prince completely crushed the Chanca army, securing a miraculous victory that would alter the course of South American history forever. In the dramatic aftermath of this triumph, he stripped his cowardly father of power and took the throne for himself, adopting a new, terrifyingly appropriate name, Pachacuti, which translates to "he who remakes the world," or Earthshaker. And true to his name, he immediately set out to literally remake the world in the image of the sun. Pachacuti was not just a brilliant military tactician, he was a restless, visionary architect of empire. Under his relentless ambition, the Inca burst out of the Cusco Valley, launching a wave of conquest that swept across the Andes with terrifying speed and surgical precision. He entirely rebuilt Cusco from a modest town into an awe-inspiring, glittering capital, supposedly laying out its massive megalithic stone walls in the shape of a crouching puma. But his greatest creation was the administrative framework of the empire itself, which he named Tawantinsuyu, meaning the realm of the four parts. He divided the vast, ever-expanding territories into 4 massive provinces, all radiating outward from the central plaza of Cusco, like spokes on a great wheel. This was no loosely held confederation of tribes. It was a deeply organized, centrally controlled state, meticulously designed to extract wealth, labor, and absolute loyalty from every corner of the forbidding Andean landscape. How does one man and one tribe rule over millions of people spread across thousands of miles of the most rugged terrain on Earth? The Inca understood perfectly well that brute military force alone could never hold such a diverse, sprawling empire together. Instead, they perfected a deeply sophisticated system of diplomacy, offering rival lords a stark, simple choice: the velvet glove or the iron fist. When the formidable Inca army approached a new territory, they did not immediately attack. Instead, they sent ambassadors bearing lavish gifts of fine textiles, exotic luxury goods, and promises of incredible wealth and protection. They politely, yet firmly, invited the local rulers to join the glorious empire of the sun. If the local lords accepted, they were allowed to keep their status, their wealth, and their lives, simply becoming regional administrators for the Inca emperor. But if they refused this generous offer, the velvet glove was swiftly removed. The highly disciplined Inca war machine would descend with terrifying brutality, utterly annihilating the resistance to serve as a bloody, unforgettable warning to anyone else who dared to defy the children of the sun. Once a territory was conquered, the true, calculating genius of Inca administration began. They were ultimate masters of assimilation, weaving incredibly diverse, fractured tribes into a single, cohesive tapestry of imperial control. To ensure absolute loyalty and prevent uprisings, they implemented a brilliant, if ruthless, system of forced migration known as the Mitma. Entire populations of newly conquered, rebellious people were suddenly uprooted from their ancestral homelands and marched hundreds of miles away to live among fiercely loyal Inca subjects. Conversely, loyal subjects were moved into newly conquered lands to act as watchdogs. This deliberate shuffling of populations completely shattered the ability of conquered tribes to organize rebellions, as they found themselves isolated in unfamiliar landscapes, entirely surrounded by strangers. Furthermore, the Inca cleverly managed the cultural integration of their subjects. They forced the conquered elites to learn Quechua, the official language of the empire, creating a common tongue that bound the diverse, sprawling regions together. Yet, the Inca did not entirely crush local beliefs. They allowed tribes to continue worshipping their own regional gods, provided they recognized Inti, the Inca sun god, as the supreme, undeniable deity above all others. They even brought the sacred idols of conquered peoples to Cusco, housing them in splendid golden temples. While this appeared to the conquered tribes as an act of profound religious respect, it was actually a brilliant political hostage situation, ensuring the good behavior of the distant provinces whose most sacred objects were held firmly in the capital. The Inca also demanded that the sons of conquered lords be sent to Cusco to be educated in the sophisticated ways of the empire. These boys grew up surrounded by Inca luxury, learning their language, adopting their dress, and completely absorbing their imperial ideology. When they eventually returned home to rule, they were thoroughly indoctrinated, acting as loyal, enthusiastic extensions of the emperor's will. Through this masterful blend of military might, psychological dominance, and highly sophisticated administration, Pachacuti and his immediate successors forged a colossal engine of civilization. In a mere 100 years, Tawantinsuyu swallowed the freezing mountains, the burning deserts, and the misty fringes of the jungle, becoming a marvel of human organization. It was an empire where millions moved to the rhythm dictated by Cusco, where vast wealth flowed seamlessly along stone roads, and where the impossible demands of the Andes were finally tamed by the collective will of a unified people. This grand imperial machine was spectacular, but to truly feel the heartbeat of this civilization, we must leave the golden palaces of the emperors and step down into the fields, the homes, and the everyday struggles of the ordinary people who carried the immense weight of the sun upon their shoulders. While the emperors in Cusco were busy redrawing the maps of the world, the true strength of the Inca Empire was being forged every single day in the freezing winds of the high plateau and the sweltering heat of the river valleys. To truly understand this civilization, we must leave behind the golden palaces and step into the worn sandals of an ordinary Andean citizen. For the common people, life was a continuous, rhythmic cycle of intense physical labor, deep communal bonds, and a profound, unbreakable connection to the earth. To live in the Andes was to understand one fundamental, undeniable truth. A human being completely alone is a human being who will simply not survive. There was no concept of rugged individualism in the Inca world. The idea of living solely for oneself, of hoarding personal wealth or turning a blind eye to a struggling neighbor, was entirely alien, almost unthinkable. Instead, every single person belonged to a tightly knit, extended community known as the Ayllu. The Ayllu was the absolute heart, soul, and beating pulse of Andean society. It was a group of families who shared a common ancestor, living together, working the same land, and sharing a collective fate. Within the Ayllu, life was governed by an elegant and powerful philosophy called Ayni, which translates roughly to reciprocity or mutualism. It was the golden rule of the mountains. Today for you, tomorrow for me. If a young couple needed to build a new stone house, they did not hire contractors or struggle to lift the heavy stones alone. The entire Ayllu would gather, blending their strength to raise the walls and weave the thatched roof in a matter of days. In return, the couple was expected to provide food and abundant amounts of chicha, a fermented corn beer, for the workers, and they were firmly bound by honor to help the next family who needed a roof. This beautiful system of shared labor and mutual obligation ensured that no one in the community starved, no orphans were abandoned, and the elderly were cared for until their final days. You were born into the Ayllu. You worked for the Ayllu, and when you died, you returned to the earth to watch over the Ayllu as a protective spirit. When the Inca emperors swept out of Cusco and conquered these vast territories, they were smart enough not to destroy this ancient, deeply ingrained way of life. Instead, they cleverly hijacked the concept of Aini and scaled it up to an imperial level. The empire did not possess any form of money. There were no gold coins exchanging hands, no bustling marketplaces where merchants haggled over prices, and no concept of a capitalist economy. In the realm of the sun, the only currency that mattered was human energy. To pay your taxes to the state, you did not give them a percentage of your crops. Instead, you gave them your sweat. This revolutionary labor tax system was known as the Mita. Every able-bodied adult male was required to dedicate a certain number of months each year to working directly for the empire. A farmer might be called away from his village to chisel stones for a new fortress, to march with the army to a distant, hostile frontier, or to risk his life suspending a woven grass bridge over a terrifying river gorge. While the men were away fulfilling their Mita obligations, the true brilliance of the Ayllu system shone through. The community simply closed ranks, stepping in to tend the absent man's fields and care for his family, so that they would not suffer while he served the state. The empire, playing the role of the ultimate benevolent patriarch, also upheld its end of the bargain. While a man was working for the state, the emperor provided all of his food, his tools, and his clothing. More importantly, the state hosted massive, lavish feasts for the laborers, overflowing with roasted meats, music, and endless clay jars of chicha. The Inca rulers understood that human beings will work far harder and with much less resentment if they feel they are participating in a grand, reciprocal festival rather than being treated as mere slaves. Through the Mita, the empire transformed the raw physical power of millions of farmers into an unstoppable machine capable of building mountaintop cities and thousands of miles of paved roads. But even with the demands of the Mita, the vast majority of an ordinary person's life was intimately tied to the soil. Farming in the Andes was not a gentle, pastoral endeavor. It was an extreme, exhausting battle against gravity, thin air, and unpredictable weather. Because there were very few flat plains, the Inca carved their fields directly into the steep, dizzying sides of the mountains. Working on these monumental agricultural terraces required incredible physical endurance. The Inca did not have the luxury of draft animals like oxen or horses to pull their plows, nor did they possess iron tools to easily slice through the rocky earth. Instead, they relied entirely on human muscle and an ingeniously simple wooden tool called the Tactile, a traditional foot plow. Men would line up across the steep terraces, driving the heavy wooden poles into the earth with their feet, using their sheer body weight to pry up massive, stubborn clods of soil. It was backbreaking work, but it was rarely done in dreary silence. Farming was a communal celebration, driven by the rhythmic chanting of the workers, moving in perfect unison across the mountainside, while women followed closely behind, breaking up the clods of earth by hand and carefully placing precious seeds into the newly opened ground. What they planted in those steep, dizzying fields is perhaps the greatest gift the Andean people ever gave to the world. While they cultivated hardy crops like quinoa, amaranth, and squash, their absolute masterpiece of agriculture was the potato. In the high Andes, they cultivated thousands of different varieties of potatoes, coming in a dizzying array of colors, shapes, and textures, perfectly adapted to thrive in specific high-altitude microclimates. But growing the food was only half the battle. Preserving it in an environment prone to sudden, devastating frosts was a matter of life and death. The ancient Andean people solved this problem by inventing one of the earliest and most effective methods of freeze-drying food in human history. During the coldest months of the year, farmers would spread thousands of potatoes out on the freezing, high-altitude grasslands just as the sun set. Overnight, the plunging temperatures would freeze the potatoes solid. The next morning, as the fierce, high-altitude sun beat down and thawed the tubers, the villagers would walk over them barefoot, using their heels to carefully and methodically squeeze out all the bitter moisture. They would repeat this exhausting process of freezing, thawing, and trampling for several days until the potatoes were transformed into small, hard, completely dehydrated pebbles known as chuno. This humble, unassuming creation was a true miracle of survival. Chuno could be stored in massive stone warehouses for years, sometimes even decades, without ever rotting or spoiling. When reconstituted in a warm soup or stew, it provided immense life-saving nourishment. It was chuno that prevented mass famines when the crops failed. It was chuno that fed the massive Inca armies as they marched across barren deserts. And it was chuno that provided the ultimate security net for an empire built on the edge of disaster. When the long, brutal day of farming or building finally came to an end, an Inca family would return to a home that was surprisingly simple and humble, even in its stark beauty. Ordinary houses were small, rectangular structures built from fieldstones and mud mortar, or sun-baked adobe bricks, topped with a thick, beautifully woven roof of ichu grass. There were no windows to let in the freezing night wind, making the interior dark, smoky, and incredibly well insulated. You would not find any wooden furniture inside an Inca home. There were no beds, no chairs, and no dining tables. Instead, the family lived, ate, and slept directly on the earth, wrapping themselves in thick, warm blankets woven from alpaca or llama pelts. The center of the home was the stone hearth, where a perpetual fire burned, filling the small room with the scent of wood smoke, roasting tubers, and simmering stews. Scurrying freely around the dirt floor of the kitchen were dozens of guinea pigs, or kai. These small animals were essentially a self-replenishing indoor meat supply, living off vegetable scraps and providing crucial, rich protein for the family during special occasions or religious festivals. Growing up in this environment was a brief and intensely practical experience. In the Inca world, childhood as we understand it today barely existed. Babies were kept tightly swaddled in wooden cradleboards, which mothers would strap to their backs as they worked in the fields or carried water from the rivers. Sometimes a mother would simply dig a small, comfortable pit in the earth, line it with soft blankets, and place her baby safely inside while her hands were busy sorting seeds or spinning wool. As soon as a child could walk and follow basic instructions, they were put to work. The Inca did not measure age in specific years, but rather in biological stages based entirely on what a person was capable of contributing to the community. A small toddler belonged to the category of those who play, but by the age of 6 or 7, a young boy would graduate to the vital role of boy who catches birds, spending long, tedious days in the fields, throwing stones and shouting to chase away hungry flocks from the precious maize crops. A young girl of the same age would be tasked with gathering firewood, fetching water, or watching over her younger siblings. As they grew into adulthood, the roles of men and women became highly distinct, yet they were deeply respected as two equal, complementary halves of a whole. The Inca viewed the universe through a lens of duality, believing that male and female energies had to work together in perfect harmony to maintain the balance of the world. Men were generally responsible for conquering the physical environment. They were the ones who forcefully drove the plow into the earth, who marched off to war, who carried massive stones to build temples, and who managed the vast herds of llamas and alpacas roaming the high pastures. Women, on the other hand, controlled the life-giving, transformative, and domestic spheres of the universe. They were the ones who placed the seed into the ground to create life, who transformed raw maize into intoxicating chicha, who prepared the meals that sustained the family, and, perhaps most importantly, who mastered the sacred, incredibly complex art of weaving. In the Andean world, textiles were not just clothing. They were a profound expression of identity, status, and spirituality, far more valuable to the Inca than gold or silver. From the moment a woman woke until the moment she went to sleep, her hands were almost always busy. She would spin raw alpaca or llama wool into fine thread using a drop spindle, perfectly twirling it in her fingers, even as she walked for miles along the mountain paths or sat gossiping with her neighbors. Using a simple backstrap loom tied around her waist and attached to a sturdy tree or post, she would weave fabrics of astonishing complexity and vibrant color. Using natural dyes extracted from crushed insects, mineral soils, and mountain plants, women wove the story of their Ayllu into every garment. The intricate geometric patterns on a man's tunic or a woman's mantle instantly communicated entirely who they were, what village they came from, and their social standing within the great empire of the sun. It was a life of profound hardship, relentless labor, and stark simplicity, yet it was brilliantly illuminated by the vibrant colors of their textiles, the deep security of their community, and an unshakable belief that every drop of sweat was part of a sacred, divine order. The Inca achieved something no other advanced civilization in recorded human history managed to do. They built a highly complex, meticulously administered empire spanning thousands of miles, overseeing millions of citizens, without ever inventing a written language. There are no ancient stone tablets etched with Inca laws, no crumbling scrolls of parchment recording their epic poetry, and no painted codices detailing their vast tax records. To a modern mind, completely reliant on the written word to organize reality, this seems like an absolute impossibility. How do you feed a continent, coordinate massive armies across perilous mountain passes, track the storage of thousands of tons of freeze-dried potatoes, and manage a sprawling government relying entirely on human memory? The answer lies in one of the most enigmatic and brilliant inventions of the ancient world. It was not a system of ink and paper, but a physical, tactile language of spinning and tying. They called it the Quipu, an intricate device made entirely of knotted cords that served as the primary accounting and storytelling tool of the empire. At first glance, a quipu looks like a simple, perhaps decorative collection of brightly colored strings dangling from a primary horizontal cord. But in the trained hands of an Inca record keeper, known as a Quipucamayoc, this cluster of wool and cotton was a highly sophisticated, three-dimensional spreadsheet. The system was breathtaking in its mathematical elegance. By tying different types of knots at specific intervals along the descending strings, the Inca utilized a base 10 decimal system to record exact quantities of anything the empire needed to track. A knot tied near the top of a string might represent 10,000, while a different knot at the bottom represented a single unit. But the Quipu recorded far more than just dry numbers. The specific color of the string, the direction the yarn was spun, the distance between the knots, and the way subsidiary cords were attached all carried complex, encoded meanings. A yellow string might represent a stockpile of gold. A white string could denote silver or alpacas, while a red string might represent the number of warriors available in a specific province. Some historians and weavers even believe that certain quipus were used to record history, genealogies, and poetry, acting as a mnemonic device where the tactile sensation of running fingers over the knots would trigger the memory of a trained storyteller, allowing them to recite epic tales of past emperors. To transmit this crucial data across the vast, rugged expanses of Tawantinsuyu, the Inca developed a postal system that rivaled anything seen in the ancient world. They relied on a relay of elite, highly trained runners known as the Chaski. These young men were stationed in small cabins spaced roughly a mile or two apart along the vast network of imperial roads. When a message or a quipu needed to be sent from a distant province to the capital of Cusco, a Chaski would grab the knotted cords and sprint at top speed to the next station, blowing a haunting, resonant blast from a pututu, a large conch shell trumpet, to warn the next runner to prepare. The moment he arrived, he would pass the quipu and recite any accompanying verbal message to the waiting runner, who would immediately dash off toward the next post. Through this relay of extraordinary physical endurance, fresh fish from the Pacific Ocean could be delivered to the emperor's plate in the high Andes in just a matter of days, and crucial military intelligence could travel hundreds of miles faster than a man riding a horse. The Chaski were the living, breathing nervous system of the empire, connecting the mind of the emperor in Cusco to the farthest, most isolated fingertips of his realm. If the Quipu was the mind of the empire, the monumental stone architecture of the Inca was its enduring, unshakable physical body. The Inca did not just build upon the mountains, they sought to seamlessly merge their creations with the natural world, crafting structures that looked as though they had naturally erupted from the living rock. Their mastery of Ashlar masonry, the art of fitting gigantic, irregularly shaped stones together without the use of any mortar, remains one of the greatest engineering marvels of human history. When you look at the massive walls of fortresses like Sacsayhuaman, which fiercely guards the hills above Cusco, you are witnessing stones that weigh over 100 tons each, carved and fitted together with such astonishing precision that not even a single blade of grass or a piece of paper can be slipped between their joints. Achieving this level of perfection without iron or steel chisels required an almost unfathomable amount of patience, labor, and skill. Inca stonemasons used harder river stones to painstakingly pound, shape, and grind the massive granite blocks into place. They would hoist a stone, check the fit against the one below it, lower it, pound away the imperfections, and hoist it again, repeating this grueling process hundreds of times until the stones locked together like a giant three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. But this monumental effort was not just for aesthetic beauty, it was a matter of sheer survival. The Andes are incredibly seismically active, constantly trembling with devastating earthquakes that would easily shatter rigid, mortar-bound brick walls. The Inca anticipated this violently shifting earth. By creating walls with perfectly interlocking, multi-angled stones that leaned slightly inward, they built structures that were brilliantly flexible. When a massive earthquake strikes, an Inca stone wall does not crack or fall, it literally dances. The stones subtly shift and bounce in place, absorbing the chaotic energy of the tremor, and as the shaking stops, they settle perfectly back into their original interlocking positions. It is a masterpiece of resilient design, proving that the Inca understood they could not overpower nature, but they could brilliantly adapt to its terrifying rhythms. Nowhere is this harmonious integration of architecture and extreme geography more breathtaking than at the legendary estate of Machu Picchu. Perched precariously on a narrow granite ridge high above the roaring Urubamba River, completely surrounded by sheer, mist-shrouded cliffs and lush emerald peaks, Machu Picchu feels like a city suspended between the earth and the heavens. Built in the mid-15th century, likely as a royal retreat for the great emperor Pachacuti, it is the ultimate expression of Inca urban planning. The city is a masterful symphony of elegant stone temples, astronomical observatories, and hundreds of cascading agricultural terraces that not only fed the elite residents, but also acted as vital retaining walls, preventing the entire mountain from collapsing in a devastating landslide. Water was brought to the city through a brilliant feat of hydraulic engineering, with a stone canal channeling a pristine mountain spring through a series of 16 perfectly carved, cascading fountains that flowed through the heart of the royal sector. Every window, every doorway, and every sacred stone at Machu Picchu was carefully aligned with the surrounding sacred peaks and the solstices of the sun, creating an environment where human ambition and the divine majesty of nature were completely indistinguishable from one another. Yet, a city as magnificent as Machu Picchu, or a capital as grand as Cusco, would be entirely useless without a way to reach it. To bind their diverse, incredibly challenging territories together, the Inca constructed the Qhapaq, a monumental network of roads that is arguably the largest and most complex infrastructure project ever undertaken in the ancient Americas. Stretching for an astonishing 25,000 miles, this royal highway system snaked through coastal deserts, carved through dense tropical jungles, and climbed terrifyingly steep mountain passes reaching altitudes of over 15,000 feet. The Inca engineers overcame the impossibly vertical landscape by carving switchbacking staircases directly into the faces of solid cliffs and building massive stone retaining walls to support elevated causeways over marshy wetlands. This road system was the vital artery of the empire, allowing the swift movement of armies, the seamless transport of tribute, and the rapid communication of the Chaski runners. But the most awe-inspiring and frankly terrifying achievements along the Qhapaq were the suspension bridges. When the Inca roads encountered a plunging river gorge or a deep impassable canyon, the engineers did not turn back. They wove a path straight through the air. Using nothing but local ichu grass, communities would gather to twist and braid thousands of thin, fragile blades into massive, incredibly strong cables, some as thick as a human torso. These enormous grass cables were hauled across the dizzying ravines, firmly anchored to massive stone pillars on either side, and then painstakingly woven together to create a swaying, suspended walkway hanging hundreds of feet above roaring whitewater rivers. Crossing one of these magnificent bridges required a steady heart and an absolute trust in the intricate communal labor that created it. Because the natural plant fibers would eventually dry out and decay, these bridges required constant, dedicated maintenance. Every single year, the local communities would gather to entirely dismantle the old bridge and weave a completely new one, a beautiful, rhythmic tradition of renewal and community service that continues in a few isolated Andean valleys to this very day. This profound sense of rhythm, renewal, and deep communal participation saturated every aspect of Inca culture, culminating in their vibrant, deeply spiritual festivals. The Inca did not draw a sharp separating line between work, religion, and celebration. Life in the Andes was dictated by the agricultural calendar, and every crucial transition of the earth was marked by massive, joyful, and deeply reverent public ceremonies. The greatest of these was Inti Raymi, the magnificent festival of the sun, held in Cusco during the winter solstice in June. As the days grew incredibly short and the freezing mountain nights stretched longer, the Inca people grew fearful that their father, the sun, was abandoning them to the cold and the dark. To coax him back, the entire capital erupted into a massive, highly choreographed spectacle of devotion. During Inti Raymi, the great plaza of Cusco transformed into a swirling sea of vibrant, extraordinary color. Tens of thousands of people from all four corners of the empire descended upon the city, wearing their finest, most intricately woven tunics and adorned with glittering gold and silver ornaments. The air vibrated with the rhythmic, hypnotic sounds of Andean music. Musicians played haunting, breathy melodies on zampoñas, the traditional bamboo panpipes, and quenas, deeply resonant flutes, sometimes carved from the bones of condors, jaguars, or even defeated enemies. The deep, thumping heartbeat of massive wooden drums echoed off the polished stone walls of the palaces, driving lines of dancers into synchronized, highly energetic movements that lasted from the freezing dawn until the stars finally emerged. Massive quantities of chicha beer flowed freely, poured out generously upon the earth to quench the thirst of the soil before being consumed in massive, joyful toasts by the revelers. Through these spectacular festivals, the harsh, unforgiving realities of Andean life were temporarily suspended. It was a time when the entire empire breathed as one single, unified organism, celebrating their survival, honoring the sheer power of the sun, and reaffirming their place within the grand eternal cycle of the universe. To witness the culture of the Inca was to see a people who took the raw, chaotic materials of a brutal landscape and wove them into a masterpiece of order, beauty, and profound spiritual connection. But this extraordinary culture was driven by a belief system that went far deeper than stone walls and woven threads, plunging into a mystical world where the mountains themselves held the power of life and death. To step into the spiritual mind of the Inca is to completely abandon the modern idea that the divine is something distant, invisible, and separated from the physical world. For the Andean people, there was no dividing line between the sacred and the mundane, no heavens situated far above an empty earth. Instead, the universe was a deeply animated, intensely living entity. Every jagged mountain peak, every rushing river, every sudden lightning strike, and every stone resting in the valley possessed a conscious, breathing spirit. They lived in a world vibrating with unseen energies, where humanity was not placed on a pedestal above nature, but was merely one small thread woven into a vast, terrifying, and beautiful cosmic tapestry. This profound worldview was rooted in a delicate, constant pursuit of balance, a desperate need to maintain harmony between the fragile world of humans and the overwhelming, unpredictable forces of the cosmos. If a drought struck or an earthquake shattered a village, it was not seen as a random natural disaster, but as a direct warning that the spiritual equilibrium had been broken, demanding immediate and sincere restitution. At the very foundation of this spiritual reality was Pachamama, the Great Mother Earth. She was the most universal and intimately worshipped deity across the entire Andes, revered long before the Inca rose to power and still deeply honored by indigenous communities today. But Pachamama was not viewed merely as a gentle, passive mother figure who unconditionally nurtured her children. She was a fiercely demanding, powerful entity who commanded immense respect. She was the soil that gave life to the precious potatoes and maize, but she was also the freezing frost that could destroy a harvest, and the violent tremors that could swallow a home. Because she constantly gave of herself to feed humanity, the Inca believed she experienced a deep, perpetual hunger that had to be satisfied. No farmer would ever dare to strike the earth with a plow or harvest a single crop without first making an offering to Pachamama. Before taking a sip of fermented chicha beer, a true Andean would always pour the first few drops directly onto the dirt, a sacred ritual known as the chala, ensuring that the mother drank before her children. It was a daily, grounded spirituality, a constant whispered conversation between the people and the dirt beneath their bare feet. While Pachamama ruled the earth below, the heavens were dominated by the supreme patriarch of the Inca pantheon, Inti, the magnificent sun god. If Pachamama was the nurturing and unpredictable mother, Inti was the absolute life-giving father of the universe, and more importantly, the divine progenitor of the royal Inca bloodline. Worship of Inti was the official state religion, the spiritual glue that the emperors used to bind their sprawling, conquered territories together. To understand the sheer scale of their devotion to the sun, one only needed to stand before the Coricancha, the absolute spiritual epicenter of the empire located in the heart of Cusco. The Coricancha, which translates to the Golden Enclosure, was a temple so breathtakingly opulent that the first Spanish chroniclers struggled to find the words to describe it. Its perfectly carved megalithic stone walls were entirely covered in massive solid plates of pure, gleaming gold. The Inca did not value gold as financial currency. They considered it to be the sweat of the sun, a sacred physical manifestation of Inti's glowing energy. When the brilliant, high-altitude sun struck the walls of the Coricancha, the entire building radiated with a blinding, divine light, visually proving to everyone who looked upon it that the sun god had chosen Cusco as his earthly home. This divine energy, however, was not confined to the walls of great temples. It flowed through the landscape in the form of huacas. A huaca was any person, place, or object that was believed to be infused with a concentrated, powerful spiritual presence. A huaca could be a grand, towering mountain peak, a strangely shaped boulder, an ancient, darkened cave, a natural spring, or even a battlefield where a great victory had been won. The Inca believed that the landscape was literally dotted with these sacred portals, and they treated them with immense reverence. In Cusco alone, there were hundreds of huacas, all connected by invisible lines of spiritual energy known as seques, radiating outward from the Coricancha like the intricate spokes of a massive cosmic wheel. When people traveled through the mountains, they would respectfully leave small stones, known as apachetas, at specific huacas along the perilous mountain passes. asking the local spirits for safe passage and protection from the biting winds and treacherous drops. The world was alive, it was watching, and it required constant acknowledgement. At the absolute pinnacle of this complex spiritual hierarchy stood a single mortal man, the Sapa Inca, the supreme emperor. But to his subjects, he was not merely a king or a political commander. He was a living, breathing god walking upon the earth. He was believed to be the direct, unbroken descendant of Inti, carrying the literal blood of the sun in his veins. Because his body was considered profoundly sacred, his feet were almost never allowed to touch the ordinary dirt of the earth. When he traveled, he was carried on a magnificent golden litter by scores of highly honored noblemen. His clothing, woven from the finest, softest vicuña wool by chosen holy women, was worn only once and then ceremonially burned, because anything that touched his divine skin absorbed his overwhelming spiritual power and became far too sacred for any ordinary human to handle. The Sapa Inca carried an unimaginable weight upon his shoulders. He was the vital bridge between the human realm and the divine forces of the cosmos. It was his absolute responsibility to perform the exact rituals, offer the correct sacrifices, and maintain the precise cosmic balance required to keep the sun rising, the rains falling, and the empire thriving. If the empire suffered, it was a terrifying sign that the living God was failing in his divine duties. This profound connection to the divine did not sever when a person's heart stopped beating. In the Inca worldview, death was not perceived as a terrifying end or a final departure into a distant heaven or hell. Instead, it was simply a transition, a movement from one phase of existence into another. They believed fiercely that a person's vital life force, their kamakin, remained anchored to their physical remains, particularly their bones, long after the flesh had failed. Because the dead were still very much present, they were completely integrated into the world of the living. The ancestors were seen as powerful, watchful guardians of the Ayllu, capable of intervening in the physical world to bring good fortune, bountiful harvests, or devastating curses if they were neglected. Therefore, tending to the dead was one of the most crucial spiritual duties of the living. Families would lovingly wrap their deceased in beautiful, finely woven textiles, placing them in fetal positions as if preparing them to be reborn from the womb of Pachamama. They were placed in open tombs, rock overhangs, or small stone towers, easily accessible to the living, because their families would regularly return to bring them offerings of food, chicha, and coca leaves. The ancestors were never truly gone. They were simply resting, listening, and quietly shaping the destiny of the children of the sun from the shadowy edges of the world. While the ordinary dead were deeply honored in Andean society, the death of a Sapa Inca unleashed a practice that completely defies our modern understanding of mortality. When an emperor stopped breathing, he did not cease to rule. He simply transitioned into a different state of being. The royal body was painstakingly mummified, likely freeze-dried in the biting Andean winds and treated with natural resins until it became perfectly preserved. But these mummies were not locked away in dark, silent tombs. They remained exactly where they had always been, sitting upon golden stools in the heart of their magnificent palaces. The deceased emperor's royal household, known as his Panaka, continued to serve him exactly as they had when he was alive. Servants meticulously brushed the mummy's hair, shooed away flies, and offered him massive daily feasts, burning the finest roasted meats and pouring out chicha beer so the royal spirit could consume the divine essence of the food. Astonishingly, these dead emperors retained absolute ownership of all their vast estates, country palaces, and thousands of servants. They were brought out into the great plaza of Cusco during major festivals, richly dressed and adorned in gold, to sit alongside the living emperor. They even paid formal visits to the mummies of other past rulers, essentially attending royal dinner parties where their dedicated attendants would interpret their desires, settle disputes, and speak entirely on their behalf. This created a highly unusual and strained political reality. Because all the wealth and land of the previous ruler remained firmly in the cold hands of a mummy, Every newly crowned Sapa Inca started his reign with virtually nothing. To build his own palaces and secure his own glorious legacy, the new living god was forced to conquer entirely new territories, a bizarre reality that relentlessly drove the explosive, unstoppable military expansion of the empire. This absolute distinction of the ruling class was not merely a matter of accumulated wealth or claims of divine blood. It was visibly and permanently etched into the very bone structures of the elite. As you walked the impeccably clean stone streets of Cusco, you could instantly identify a person of noble birth, not just by the vibrant brilliance of their textiles, but by the extreme physical shape of their head. The Inca practiced a dramatic form of body modification known as cranial deformation. When an aristocratic child was born, while their infant skull was still incredibly soft and pliable, their head was carefully bound between flat wooden boards or wrapped tightly in unyielding woolen cloth. Over months and years, this constant, gentle pressure forced the skull to grow upward and backward, resulting in a distinctly elongated, conical shape. Far from being seen as a disfigurement or an act of cruelty, this dramatic alteration was considered the absolute pinnacle of physical beauty and a clear, undeniable marker of high intelligence and divine favor. It boldly signaled to the masses that the nobility were quite literally shaped differently from the common earth, biologically destined to rule over the children of the sun from the very moment they drew their first breath. Yet, despite their exalted, nearly divine status, the Inca were still mortal men who fought brutal, crushing wars. And it is in the bloody aftermath of these battles that we discover one of their most astonishing scientific achievements. The primary weapons of ancient Andean warfare were deeply concussive. Heavy wooden clubs embedded with star-shaped copper spikes, and woven slings that could hurl river stones with the devastating velocity of a modern bullet. Consequently, the Inca army saw a staggering number of severe head traumas and fractured skulls. To save their most valued warriors, Inca healers developed an extraordinarily advanced form of brain surgery known as trepanation. Using a simple, razor-sharp knife made of obsidian glass or bronze, the ancient surgeon would carefully scrape, carve, or drill a circular hole directly through the living patient's skull. This procedure was desperately needed to remove shattered bone fragments and relieve the immense, fatal pressure of pooling blood on the brain. To a modern ear, this sounds like an absolute butchery, a guaranteed death sentence in a world without sterile operating rooms. Yet, bioarchaeologists have examined thousands of these drilled skulls and made a shocking discovery. The survival rate for this extreme ancient surgery was remarkably high, often exceeding 80%, a success rate that vastly outperformed the battlefield surgeons of the American Civil War centuries later. Lacking modern anesthetics, the Inca relied entirely on the profound numbing properties of the sacred coca leaf, chewing massive wads of the plant to induce localized numbness, combined with heavy amounts of intoxicating chicha to keep the patient docile while the surgeon painstakingly carved into the seat of their consciousness. But there was one practice, hidden deep within the freezing, snowy peaks of the Andes, that remains the most chilling and deeply misunderstood aspect of the empire. When the delicate equilibrium of the cosmos was shattered by an extreme, terrifying crisis, a devastating volcanic eruption, a prolonged and starving drought, or the sudden death of the supreme emperor, the Inca believed that standard offerings of llamas or agricultural goods were no longer enough to appease the furious gods. To restore the balance of the universe, they turned to the Qhapaq, the solemn and profoundly sacred ritual of child sacrifice. Unlike the Aztec Empire in Central America, which famously practiced frequent mass human sacrifice on towering pyramids to feed the sun with blood, the Inca approach was incredibly rare, highly targeted, and wrapped in immense reverence. Only the most physically perfect, unblemished children from across the sprawling empire were chosen, considered the ultimate, purest offering humanity could possibly make. For the child's family, it was seen as an unfathomable honor, instantly elevating their social status and securing immense political favor from the state. the chosen children would be brought to Cusco for grand feasts and blessings by the emperor himself, before embarking on a grueling, months-long pilgrimage to the highest, most unforgiving summits of the Andes. When they reached the icy peaks, standing closer to the stars than to the earth, the children were given heavy doses of coca and deeply intoxicating chicha until they slipped into a heavy, peaceful stupor. They were then gently placed in small, perfectly crafted stone tombs, surrounded by exquisite golden figurines and fine textiles. Some were killed with a swift single blow to the head, but many were simply left to fall asleep in the freezing, thin air, dying quietly of exposure. The Inca did not believe these children were dead. They believed they had been gloriously transformed into divine, immortal emissaries, forever living upon the sacred peaks to watch over the empire and whisper directly into the ears of the gods on behalf of the desperate people below. But no amount of whispered prayers from the icy summits could have prepared the Inca for the terrifying catastrophe that was about to arrive from across the sea. The glory of Tawantinsuyu was magnificent, yet its fall was brutally and tragically sudden. In the early 16th century, the arrival of Spanish conquistadors completely shattered the world of the Inca. However, it was not merely European steel, horses, or gunpowder that brought the great empire to its knees. The invisible, devastating terror of smallpox had swept down the continent long before the conquerors even set foot in the Andes, ravaging the native population and sparking a bitter, bloody civil war over the royal succession. When Francisco Pizarro and his men finally marched into the heart of Cusco, they found an empire that was already heavily bleeding from within. The grand temples were ruthlessly looted. The shimmering golden plates of the Coricancha were ripped from the walls and melted down into crude coins, and the sacred mummies of the emperors were burned or hidden away. The physical, administrative machinery of the empire was systematically dismantled and replaced by a harsh colonial regime that sought to entirely erase the ancient Andean ways. Yet, while the political empire of the sun was violently broken, the children of the sun were not extinguished. Their true legacy did not vanish into the mists of history. It simply retreated high into the unforgiving mountains, embedding itself deep within the unbreakable spirit of the people. Today, the echoes of that magnificent civilization remain vibrantly alive across South America, proving that a culture forged in the harshest landscape on Earth cannot be easily erased. The most powerful testament to their endurance is the survival of the Quechua language. Despite centuries of intense colonial suppression and overwhelming pressure to assimilate, Quechua is still spoken by millions of people across Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. It is a living, breathing language that still carries the ancient concepts of the Inca worldview within its very grammar and vocabulary. If you travel high into the remote Andean villages, far from the bustling modern cities, you will find that the foundational pillars of daily Inca life remain entirely intact. The ancient concept of the Ayllu, the tight-knit, mutually supportive community, still governs social interactions. Neighbors still practice the sacred rule of Aini, coming together to build houses, clear irrigation canals, and harvest fields with the exact same spirit of joyful reciprocity that guided their ancestors centuries ago. Even the ingenious agricultural methods of the past have survived, not out of mere historical nostalgia, but out of sheer, practical necessity. Modern Andean farmers still cultivate high-altitude potatoes using the traditional wooden foot plow. They still freeze-dry their harvest into resilient chuno under the bitter cold night skies, and they still rely heavily on the ancient terraced slopes that have held the steep mountains together for generations. However, this resilient ancient way of life is now facing unprecedented and deeply complex challenges in the 21st century. The relentless creeping march of modern globalization is slowly eroding the isolated geographical boundaries that once naturally protected these traditional communities. Younger generations, driven by the urgent need for economic stability and modern education, are increasingly migrating away from the harsh, high-altitude villages, descending into the crowded, sprawling cities. As they leave the mountains behind, The delicate oral transmission of ancient knowledge is heavily threatened. The highly complex symbolic art of traditional weaving, which requires immense patience and lifelong dedication, is slowly fading as cheaper, mass-produced clothing becomes easily accessible. Perhaps even more alarming is the undeniable, devastating impact of a rapidly warming planet. The great snow-capped peaks of the Andes, revered for centuries as the sacred living Apus, are rapidly losing their ancient glaciers. These disappearing ice caps represent far more than just a profound loss of spiritual guardians. They are the crucial, life-sustaining water sources that have fed the terraced valleys for millennia. As the ice vanishes, it poses a terrifying existential threat to the future of Andean agriculture and the very survival of the mountain communities. Compounding these severe environmental and cultural shifts is the overwhelming constant pressure of global tourism. The mist-shrouded, majestic ruins of Machu Picchu have transformed from a forgotten, silent sanctuary into one of the most famous and heavily visited tourist destinations on the entire planet. Millions of travelers from across the globe flock to the sacred valley each year, seeking to capture a fleeting glimpse of the ancient magic. This massive influx brings vital, necessary economic revenue to the region, providing jobs and modern infrastructure for local communities, but it operates as a very sharp, dangerous double-edged sword. The sheer physical weight of millions of footsteps threatens to permanently erode the delicate stone terraces and ancient carved pathways that were simply never designed to hold such massive, continuous crowds. Furthermore, there is a constant, exhausting struggle to prevent the deep, profound spirituality of the Andean people from being reduced to a mere commodity, a packaged, easily digestible spectacle sold to transient visitors. The modern descendants of the Inca are fighting a delicate, ongoing battle to share their majestic heritage with the world, while fiercely protecting the sacred dignity of their ancestors from the relentless, consuming demands of the modern age. Ultimately, the story of the Inca is not a tragedy defined by how they fell, but an awe-inspiring testament to how they rose. When we look upon the silent, enduring stones of Machu Picchu or the massive, intricately interlocking walls of Cusco, we are not merely looking at the dead ruins of a vanquished empire. We are standing face to face with a profound philosophy of human existence, perfectly carved into solid granite. The Inca achieved the impossible by recognizing a fundamental truth that modern society has so often forgotten. Humanity cannot conquer the earth by fighting against it. They looked at the terrifying vertical extremes of the Andes and chose to weave themselves completely into its fabric. They aligned their grandest ambitions with the shifting stars, the rushing rivers, and the fierce, high-altitude sun. Their brilliance lay not in the invention of the wheel, forged iron tools, or a written alphabet, but in their extraordinary capacity to organize millions of people into a single, harmonious, and breathing organism. As we navigate an increasingly fragmented and isolated modern world, the ancient voices of the Andes offer a powerful, deeply urgent lesson. They remind us that true enduring resilience is never found in rugged individualism, but within the unbreakable, sacred bonds of community. The spirit of Aini, the unwavering commitment to mutual care and shared labor, stands as a brilliant counter-narrative to a world so often driven by personal ambition and accumulation. The Inca understood on a molecular level that if your neighbor starves, the entire community weakens, and if the earth is continuously abused without respect, it will eventually cease to give life. Their profound reverence for Pachamama was not a primitive superstition, but a deeply practical, incredibly respectful recognition of the fragile ecological balance that sustains all human existence. It is a wisdom that feels vastly more relevant today than ever before, whispering a quiet, persistent warning from the high mountaintops that we must urgently learn to cherish and protect the natural world that holds us. The supreme Sapa Incas may no longer be carried on glittering golden litters through the grand plazas, and the mighty imperial armies no longer march across the swaying woven grass bridges of the great highland roads. But if you stand quiet and still in the vast freezing expanse of the high Andean plateau, You can still feel their undeniable, overwhelming presence. You can hear them in the rhythmic, ancient beating of the backstrap loom, in the communal chanting of the farmers driving the heavy wooden plow into the soil, and in the haunting, breathy melody of a bamboo flute echoing across a deep, misty river gorge. The political empire of Tawantinsuyu has long since faded back into the dust, but the children of the sun never truly vanished. They simply became part of the eternal landscape, their unyielding spirits lingering forever in the biting mountain wind, the towering sacred peaks, and the warm golden light that faithfully continues to rise over the Andes every single morning.